Black woman took in 3 homeless little girls. 26 years later, they stopped her life sentence. I didn't kill anybody. Marcia Ashford pressed her trembling hands against the cold metal table as Detective Blake Carrington slid another photograph across the scratched surface. The image showed Mrs. Whitmore's lifeless body sprawled beside her overturned wheelchair, medication bottles scattered like accusations across the nursing home floor. The security footage shows you were the last person in her room, Marcia. Your fingerprints are on the medication cart. The woman is dead, and you're telling me it's just coincidence. 26 years of caring for others, 26 years of working double shifts and scraping together every penny. And this is where it led, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while they tried to convince her she was a killer. Mrs. Whitmore was like family to me. I would never. A family that left you $40,000 in her will, according to this. Blake tapped a legal document. Funny how people who need money always seem to be around when old folks have accidents. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Marcia's vision blurred as the interrogation room seemed to shrink around her. How had helping Mrs. Whitmore right her will become evidence of murder? How had 26 years of sacrificing everything for others led to this nightmare? But the real devastation wasn't the accusations. It was the silence. 3 weeks since her arrest, and the phone hadn't rung once. Not from Celeste, who she'd raised from a terrified 8-year-old into Harvard Law School. Not from Ivy, who'd graduated medical school last spring. Not from Paige, whose investigative journalism had just won a national award. The 3 little girls she'd found shivering behind that bus stop, the ones she'd given everything to raise. They'd vanished from her life the moment she needed them most. Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well today. Drop a comment, and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far, and where you are watching from. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because the tension is only just starting to build, and trust me, you are going to want to know how this goes. Blake leaned back in his chair, studying her with cold calculation. Here's what I think happened, Marcia. You've been struggling financially your whole life. Working at Sunset Manor for 15 years, watching rich families dump their relatives and never visit. You saw an opportunity with Mrs. Whitmore, a lonely old woman with no family, just a nurse's aide who pretended to care. I did care, Marcia whispered, but her voice cracked with exhaustion. Sure you did. Right up until you realized she was worth more dead than alive. A little mix-up with her medications, a convenient fall, and suddenly you're looking at $40,000. Maybe enough to finally stop living paycheck to paycheck. The accusation was so wrong it physically hurt. Mrs. Whitmore hadn't been just another resident. She'd been Marcia's afternoon confidant. The woman who'd listened to her stories about raising 3 girls alone, who'd celebrated every graduation and achievement like a proud grandmother. The medication error wasn't my fault, Marcia said, her voice stronger now. I followed protocol exactly. Someone else had access to that cart after I left the room. Except the security footage shows the cart was locked when you left. Only you had the key code that night. Marcia's heart pounded. That couldn't be right. She distinctly remembered seeing Administrator Harrington near the medication room after her shift ended. But when she tried to voice this, Blake was already standing. Here's the deal, Marcia. The prosecutor is willing to discuss manslaughter instead of first-degree murder if you cooperate. That's 15 years instead of life. Your girls are adults now. They don't need you anymore. Take the plea, serve your time, and maybe you'll still have a few years left when you get out. The words echoed in the silence as Blake left her alone with the photographs and the crushing weight of abandonment. Celeste, Ivy, and Paige had disappeared so completely from her life that even her public defender had stopped asking about character witnesses. But Blake was wrong about one thing. The girls she'd raised weren't gone because they didn't need her anymore. They were gone because they were planning something that would either save her life or destroy their own careers in the process. And at that exact moment, 300 miles away, Celeste Beckwith was walking into the most important meeting of her legal career, carrying evidence that would prove everyone had been looking at the wrong crime entirely. 26 years earlier, Marcia Ashford had been rushing to catch the last bus home from her night shift at the hospital when she saw them. 3 small figures huddled against the brick wall behind the bus stop, their clothes soaked through from the December rain that had been falling for hours. The oldest couldn't have been more than 8. Blonde hair plastered to her skull, arms wrapped protectively around 2 smaller girls who looked like carbon copies of her. Same pale skin, same frightened blue eyes, same way of trying to disappear into themselves. Marcia's first instinct was to keep walking. She was 22, barely keeping her own head above water on a nurse's aide salary, living in a one-bedroom apartment where the heat only worked half the time. She had student loans, credit card debt, and exactly $43 in her checking account until Friday. But something about the way the oldest girl looked at her stopped everything. It wasn't pleading or desperate. It was resigned. Like she'd already accepted that adults would walk past without helping, that being invisible was safer than hoping for rescue. "Hey," Marcia said, crouching down despite the rain soaking through her scrubs. "You girls okay?" The oldest girl's grip tightened on her sister's. "We're fine. When's the last time you ate?" Silence. "What are your names?" More silence, but Marcia caught the youngest girl's stomach growling audibly. "I'm Marcia. I live about 10 minutes from here. You want to come get warm and maybe have some soup?" "We can't." The oldest girl's voice was barely a whisper. "We're not supposed to go with strangers." "Smart rule. But you also can't stay out here all night in this weather." Marcia sat down on the wet concrete, ignoring how the cold seeped through her pants. "How about this? You tell me your first names, and I'll tell you exactly where we're going. My apartment is in the Riverside Complex on Oak Street. Unit 2B. If you don't feel safe, you can leave anytime." The middle girl, maybe 6 years old, spoke first. "I'm Ivy." "Ivy, that's a beautiful name." Marcia smiled. "Like the plant that stays green all year long." "I'm Paige," whispered the youngest, who couldn't have been older than 5. The oldest girl hesitated. "Celeste." Celeste, Ivy, and Paige. Pretty names for brave girls. Marcia stood slowly. "Come on. Let's get you somewhere warm." What Marcia didn't know was that Administrator Harrington at Sunset Manor had been watching her for months, waiting for exactly the right moment to destroy her reputation. And as she led 3 homeless children to safety that night, she was walking directly into a trap that wouldn't spring for 26 years. The walk to Marcia's apartment revealed fragments of their story. Their mother had died 3 weeks ago. Overdose, Celeste whispered when her sisters weren't listening. They'd been staying with their mother's boyfriend, but he'd kicked them out 2 days earlier when the landlord threatened eviction. Foster care splits up families, Celeste explained with 8-year-old wisdom that broke Marcia's heart. "We stay together." Marcia's apartment was barely big enough for 1 person, let alone 4. But she gave the girls her bed, made soup from a can, and spent the night on the couch listening to them whisper to each other in the dark. The kind of protective murmuring that came from children who'd learned to parent themselves. The next morning brought the first betrayal. Social worker Helena Granger arrived with 2 police officers and a clipboard full of official documentation. Someone had called in a report about an unlicensed woman harboring minors. "Miss Ashford, I understand you have good intentions," Helena said, her voice professionally sympathetic as the girls clung to Marcia's legs. "But these children need proper placement. We have a lovely family ready to take Celeste, and another family interested in Ivy and Paige. You're splitting them up." Marcia's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she touched Celeste's hair. "They need to stay together. Unfortunately, finding a family willing to take 3 children is extremely difficult. But they'll have supervised visits and—" "No." Celeste's voice cut through the adult conversation like a blade. "We won't go." "Sweetheart, you don't understand." "I understand plenty." For 8 years old, Celeste's voice carried remarkable authority. "You want to put us in different houses with strangers who might hurt us or give us back when we're too much trouble. We've been taking care of ourselves just fine." Helena's professional smile faltered. "Miss Ashford, if you interfere with this placement, you could face charges for kidnapping." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Marcia looked down at 3 faces that had learned to expect abandonment, at children who'd survived on their own for weeks because every adult in their lives had failed them. She made the decision that would define the next 26 years. "I want a petition for emergency guardianship." Helena's clipboard nearly slipped from her hands. "Miss Ashford, you're 22 years old with no experience raising children. You work minimum wage and live in a 1-bedroom apartment. The state requires." "Then tell me what I need to do to meet the requirements." But Helena Granger had her own secrets. Secrets connected to a network of families who paid substantial fees for private adoptions. 3 blonde, blue-eyed girls would be worth a fortune to the right buyers. And Marcia Ashford had just declared war on a system that had been profiting from broken families for decades. The next 6 months were brutal. Marcia moved to a 2-bedroom apartment she couldn't afford. She took on double shifts, working days at the hospital and nights cleaning offices. She attended parenting classes, underwent background checks, and endured home inspections where social workers scrutinized everything from her refrigerator contents to her credit score. The girls weren't officially in her care yet, but Helena had grudgingly agreed to temporary placement while the paperwork processed. Every night, Marcia came home exhausted to find Celeste helping Ivy with homework she'd taught herself to read, Paige setting the table with mismatched plates. All three of them waiting for the hug that meant they were safe for another day. "Why are you doing this?" Celeste asked one evening as Marcia braided her hair before bed. "We're not your responsibility." Marcia's hands stilled. How could she explain that she'd grown up in foster care too? That she'd been passed from family to family until she'd aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a fierce determination never to let another child feel that kind of abandonment? "Because you deserve better," she said simply. "And because families aren't just about blood. Sometimes they're about choice." That night, she heard Celeste whispering to her sisters, "She's going to keep us." She promised. But promises, Marcia was about to learn, were fragile things when powerful people wanted them broken. The call came on a Tuesday morning in July. Helena's voice was crisp with barely concealed satisfaction. "Miss Ashford, I'm afraid there's been a development. The girl's biological father has been located. He's petitioning for custody." Marcia's coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. "Father?" Celeste said he wasn't in their lives. "Apparently he's recently completed a rehabilitation program and secured steady employment. He's requesting immediate reunification with his daughters." The words felt like physical blows. "What kind of rehabilitation?" "That's confidential, but I can tell you the court views family reunification as the primary goal whenever possible. 6 months of sacrifice, 6 months of building trust and love and hope, and it could all disappear with one phone call from a man who'd never bothered to call before." "I want to contest this," Marcia said. "Miss Ashford, you have no legal standing. You're not a relative, and your guardianship petition is still pending. If the biological father wants his children back." The line went dead, leaving Marcia staring at 3 backpacks lined up by the door. The same backpacks the girls had been carrying that night behind the bus stop, now stuffed with clothes she'd bought them, homework they'd completed at her kitchen table, and the kind of small treasures children accumulate when they finally have a place to keep things safe. But what Helena Granger didn't know was that Marcus Pembroke, the girl's biological father, wasn't interested in reunification. He was interested in the substantial payment he'd been offered to sign away his parental rights to a very wealthy family who specialized in private adoptions. And when Marcia discovered the truth, she would make an enemy who would spend the next 26 years waiting for revenge. The meeting with Marcus Pembroke took place in a sterile conference room at the Department of Social Services, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while 3 little girls sat in the hallway, swinging their legs from chairs too big for them. Marcia studied the man who claimed to be their father. Mid-30s, nervous energy, eyes that wouldn't quite meet hers. He kept checking his phone and fidgeting with a business card he'd pulled from his wallet. "I want what's best for my girls," Marcus said for the 3rd time, the words sounding rehearsed. "I've got my life together now. Steady job, clean apartment." Helena Granger nodded approvingly from across the table. "Mr. Pembroke has completed a 12-month residential treatment program and has been sober for 14 months. His employment verification shows steady income as a warehouse supervisor." "Where were you when their mother died?" Marcia asked quietly. Marcus shifted in his chair. "I was getting help. Getting clean. Linda and we had our problems, but I loved those girls. I just wasn't ready to be a father then. And you're ready now? After 6 months of them building a life with me? They're my blood." His voice gained conviction, like he was remembering his script. "A father's rights can't be erased just because someone else wants to play house." The words stung, but Marcia kept her expression neutral. "Have you asked them what they want?" "They're children," Helena interjected smoothly. "The court determines what's in their best interest, not their preferences." That's when Marcia noticed it. The business card Marcus kept turning over in his hands. She could just make out part of the logo, Fairchild Family Services. Her blood went cold. Fairchild Family Services wasn't a legitimate social services agency. It was a private adoption facilitator that had been investigated twice for questionable practices. Wealthy families paying enormous fees to adopt children whose parents had been coerced into signing away their rights. "Excuse me," Marcia said, standing abruptly. "I need to use the restroom." In the hallway, She knelt in front of the three girls. Celeste's face was pale, her arms wrapped protectively around her sister's. "Are we going with him?" Celeste whispered. "I don't know yet, baby. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you remember your father?" Celeste and Ivy exchanged glances. Paige shook her head. "He came around sometimes when Mama was using," Ivy said quietly. "He scared us. He yelled a lot and broke things." "Did he ever hurt you?" "Not us," Celeste said. "But he hurt Mama. That's why she made us hide in the closet when he visited." Marcia's hands clenched into fists. This man wasn't interested in reunification. He was being paid to deliver 3 children to buyers who would make them disappear into the private adoption market. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the number for legal aid. "Sarah Lockwood, please. Tell her it's Marcia Ashford, and it's an emergency." But as Marcia waited for Sarah to answer, Helena Granger was making a phone call of her own to Administrator Harrington at Sunset Manor, setting in motion a plan that would take 26 years to reach its devastating conclusion. Sarah Lockwood arrived within an hour, a fierce woman in her 50s who specialized in family law and had seen every dirty trick in the system. She listened to Marcia's suspicions about Fairchild Family Services while reviewing Marcus Pembroke's sudden petition for custody. "The timeline is suspicious," Sarah agreed. "Father makes no contact for years, then suddenly appears with legal representation and perfect documentation, just as you're about to finalize guardianship? Someone's orchestrating this." They returned to the conference room where Marcus was now accompanied by a lawyer in an expensive suit, Alexander Cranford from Cranford & Associates, a firm that specialized in adoption law. "Mr. Cranford," Sarah said coolly, "I wasn't aware private adoption attorneys handled custody disputes." Alexander's smile was predatory. "My client has rights that supersede any arrangement Miss Ashford believes she's made with his children." "Interesting. And who's paying your fees?" "Warehouse supervisors don't typically retain counsel from Cranford & Associates." Marcus's face flushed. I'm paying." "Actually," Alexander interrupted smoothly, "Mr. Pembroke's fees are being covered by a charitable foundation that assists parents seeking reunification with their children." "What foundation?" Sarah demanded. "The Fairchild Foundation. They specialize in helping families torn apart by addiction and poverty." Marcia felt sick. They weren't even trying to hide the connection anymore. "I want a psychological evaluation," Sarah announced. "And a home study. If Mr. Pembroke is truly committed to reunification, he won't object to a thorough assessment." Marcus looked panicked. "I don't think that's necessary. My client agrees to any evaluation the court requires," Alexander said quickly. "However, we maintain that prolonging this process serves no one's interests. These children have already been separated from their father for too long." Helena shuffled her papers with bureaucratic efficiency. "The state prefers expedited reunification when biological parents have demonstrated rehabilitation." "Then let's expedite the evaluation too," Sarah countered. "I want court-appointed psychologists, not anyone affiliated with Fairchild Services." The meeting ended in a tense stalemate, but Marcia could see the trap closing around them. Marcus might fail a psychological evaluation, but with enough money and preparation, even that could be manipulated. That evening, as she tucked the girls into bed, Celeste asked the question Marcia had been dreading. "If the judge makes us go with him, will you fight for us?" Marcia knelt beside the bed, looking at 3 faces that had learned to trust her completely. "I will fight until there's no fight left in me. Even if it means breaking the law." The question hung in the air like smoke. Even at 8 years old, Celeste understood that sometimes protecting the people you love meant risking everything. "Even then," Marcia whispered. That promise would come back to haunt her 26 years later, when prosecutor Bradley Davenport would use her own words against her, painting her as someone willing to break any rule to get what she wanted, even if it meant murdering an elderly woman for inheritance money. The psychological evaluation took place the following week. Dr. Gabriel Stanhope, the court-appointed psychologist, spent 2 hours with Marcus Pembroke and emerged with a troubled expression. "Off the record," he told Sarah in the hallway, "that man has no interest in raising children. He answered questions about parenting like someone cramming for a test he didn't want to take. Can you recommend against reunification? Not based on one interview. Legally, he's met the requirements: clean drug tests, stable housing, employment verification. My personal instincts don't carry weight in family court." Sarah closed her eyes. "What about the girls?" "That's where it gets interesting. I've never seen children more bonded to a non-biological caregiver. They're thriving academically, emotionally stable, and show clear signs of feeling secure in their current placement. But Father's rights trump everything else. Unless we can prove he's unfit or that reunification would cause immediate harm. That afternoon, Sarah called Marcia with devastating news. Marcus Pembroke passed his evaluation with flying colors. Someone coached him extensively. He knew exactly what to say about child development, discipline techniques, everything. Marcia sank into her kitchen chair, watching through the window as Celeste pushed Ivy on the swing set she'd bought at a yard sale. How long do we have? The judge wants to begin supervised visitation immediately. If that goes well, he'll grant custody within 30 days. 30 days to prove that a man with expensive legal representation and a powerful adoption agency behind him was planning to sell 3 children to the highest bidder. Marcia had faced impossible odds before, but never with stakes this high. She was about to discover that some people would do anything to protect their profitable secrets, including destroying anyone who got in their way. The first supervised visit was scheduled for Saturday morning at the department offices. Marcus arrived with gifts, expensive toys the girls eyed suspiciously, like children who'd learned not to trust sudden generosity. "Go ahead," urged the supervising social worker. "Your daddy brought these just for you." Paige hid behind Celeste's legs. Ivy clutched Marcia's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. "I don't remember him," Paige whispered. Marcus forced a smile. "You were just little, sweetheart. But Daddy's back now, and we're going to be a family again." "We already have a family," Celeste said quietly. The supervising social worker made notes on her clipboard. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained gentle. "I know Miss Marcia has taken good care of you, but I'm your real father. Blood is thicker than water." "Blood made Mama sick," Ivy said suddenly. "Blood made you hurt her." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Marcus's mask slipped for just a moment, long enough for Marcia to see the flash of anger in his eyes before the supervised visit was abruptly ended. As they walked to the car, Celeste tugged on Marcia's sleeve. "He's not going to keep us," she said with 8-year-old certainty. "What do you mean?" He kept looking at that lady through the window, the one who was watching us, and he asked the social worker about our birth certificates and medical records. Celeste's eyes were too old for her face. "He's going to sell us, isn't he?" The truth hit Marcia like a physical blow. Celeste had figured out what all the adults were pretending not to see. That night, Marcia made the phone call that would seal all their fates. She called Detective Dylan Ellsworth, a friend from her high school who now worked with the trafficking unit. What she was about to set in motion would save 3 little girls and create enemies who would spend decades plotting their revenge. Detective Dylan Ellsworth arrived at Marcia's apartment after midnight, moving like a man who understood that walls had ears and phones could be tapped. His face was grim as he settled at her kitchen table, accepting coffee with hands that shook slightly. "You were right to call me," he said quietly. "But what I'm about to tell you stays in this room." Marcia nodded, her heart pounding. "Fairchild Family Services has been on our radar for 2 years. We believe they're operating an illegal adoption ring, taking children from vulnerable families and selling them to wealthy buyers who want to skip traditional adoption processes. No background checks, no waiting periods, no questions about why a family might be rejected by legitimate agencies." "How many children?" "We estimate at least 40 over the past 5 years. Maybe more." Dylan pulled out a thin folder. "The problem is proving it. They're careful, use legitimate social workers, real lawyers, proper documentation. By the time we realize what happened, the children have disappeared into new identities with families who may not even know they're participating in human trafficking." Marcia's coffee grew cold in her hands. "What about Marcus?" "Marcus Pembroke is a pawn. Addiction makes people desperate, and desperate people make choices they wouldn't normally make." Dylan opened the folder, revealing surveillance photos. "We've been watching him for 3 weeks. Someone's been coaching him, prepping him for interviews, teaching him what to say. But here's the thing, after he gets custody of your girls, they won't stay with him long." "What do you mean?" "The pattern is always the same. Biological parent regains custody, then within a few months has a family crisis, job loss, illness, something that makes them unable to care for the children. They voluntarily surrender them to a private agency, which immediately places them with pre-selected families for enormous fees." The room seemed to spin around Marcia. "You're talking about my girls like they're already gone. They don't have to be." Dylan leaned forward. We want to use this case to bring down the entire network. But we need evidence, and we need time to build an airtight case. How much time? 6 months. Maybe a year. Dylan, the judge is granting Marcus custody in 3 weeks. That's why we need your help. We want you to cooperate with the custody transfer. No. Marcia stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. Absolutely not. Hear me out. We place surveillance on Marcus, track his contacts, document everything. The girls would be in minimal danger, because we'd be watching constantly. Minimal danger? Marcia's voice rose, then dropped to a furious whisper as she remembered the sleeping children down the hall. You want me to hand 3 little girls over to human traffickers and hope your surveillance is good enough to prevent them from disappearing forever? Marcia, this is bigger than just Celeste, Ivy, and Paige. If we can prove Fairchild is trafficking children, then find another way. Her voice was steel. Those girls have been abandoned and betrayed by every adult in their lives. I won't be another one. Dylan closed his eyes. If you fight this custody order, you'll lose. And when you lose, the girls disappear anyway, but we lose our chance to save the other children being trafficked. The weight of the decision crushed down on her. Save 3 children she loved, or potentially save dozens of children she'd never meet. But what neither Marcia nor Dylan knew was that Helena Granger had been listening to every word through a bug planted in Marcia's apartment 3 days earlier. And at that moment, she was making a phone call that would destroy both their lives. The next morning brought the first sign that everything was unraveling. Sarah Lockwood called before 7 a.m., her voice tight with controlled panic. Marcia, we have a problem. Someone leaked information about the police investigation to Marcus's lawyer. Alexander Cranford is claiming harassment and demanding an immediate custody hearing. How is that possible? I don't know, but it gets worse. Helena Granger filed a report stating that you've been coaching the children to lie about their father. She's recommending immediate removal from your home. Marcia sank against her kitchen counter. They're escalating because they know we're onto them. It's more than that. Someone with serious connections is pulling strings. I've never seen a family court case move this fast or with this much pressure from above. Through the window, Marcia watched Celeste helping Paige tie her shoes for school. Normal morning routine in a life that was about to implode. How long do we have? Emergency hearing is scheduled for this afternoon. Judge Hawthorne wants to see you, the children, and Marcus in chambers at 2 p.m. Sarah, if they take the girls today. I know. We're going to fight, but I won't lie to you. The deck is stacked against us. After Sarah hung up, Marcia called the school to excuse the girls from classes. She couldn't risk them being picked up by social services while she was in court. Mama Marcia? Celeste appeared in the kitchen doorway, using the name that had developed naturally over the past 6 months. Why aren't we going to school? Come here, baby. Celeste approached cautiously, followed by Ivy and Paige. Even at their young ages, they'd learned to read the subtle signs of adult distress. We need to have a grown-up conversation, Marcia said, kneeling to their eye level. Remember how I told you that sometimes adults have to make hard choices to protect the people they love? 3 solemn nods. Today, some people are going to try to separate us. They're going to say it's what's best for you, but they're lying. They want to hurt you, and they're using your father to do it. We won't go with him, Celeste said immediately. It might not be up to you, sweetheart. But I need you to know that no matter what happens, I will never stop fighting for you. Even if they take you away from me, even if years go by, I will find a way to bring you home. Paige started crying. Ivy wrapped her arms around Marcia's neck. Can we run away? Celeste asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcia had considered it, taking the girls and disappearing, starting over somewhere with new names and new lives. But 3 children couldn't hide forever, and when they were found, the charges against her would be so severe that the girls would disappear into the system permanently. Running away would make me look guilty, Marcia said gently. And guilty people don't get to keep their families. But if they take us, then I trust you to be smart and brave until I can get you back. What Marcia didn't know was that Celeste had already made her own plan. At 8 years old, she understood that sometimes children had to save themselves. And she was about to do something that would either rescue her family or destroy them all. The emergency hearing took place in Judge Hawthorne's chambers, a wood-paneled room that smelled like old books and broken dreams. Judge Hawthorne was a stern woman in her 60s who'd seen every variation of family tragedy and had long ago stopped believing in happy endings. Marcus sat beside his expensive lawyer, fidgeting with his phone and avoiding eye contact with the girls. Helena Granger had positioned herself strategically near the court recorder, her clipboard full of damning observations about Marcia's emotional instability and inappropriate attachment to children who weren't legally hers. "Miss Ashford," Judge Hawthorne began, "I understand you have objections to reunifying these children with their biological father. Your Honor, I have serious concerns about Mr. Pembroke's motives and his ability to safely care for these children." "Concerns based on what evidence?" "Mr. Pembroke has completed rehabilitation, maintained steady employment, and passed all court-ordered evaluations." Sarah stood. "Your Honor, we believe Mr. Pembroke is being paid by a private adoption agency to surrender these children after gaining custody." Alexander Cranford was on his feet immediately. "Objection. That's a serious allegation with no supporting evidence. My client's motives are being questioned simply because Miss Ashford doesn't want to relinquish control." "Do you have proof of this alleged conspiracy, Miss Lockwood?" Judge Hawthorne asked. Sarah hesitated. Dylan's investigation was ongoing, with no concrete evidence yet. "We're requesting time to investigate. Time these children don't have. They've been in limbo for 6 months while Miss Ashford has grown inappropriately attached. Mr. Pembroke has legal rights that supersede any emotional bonds formed during temporary placement." Marcia felt the walls closing in. "Your Honor, please ask the children what they want. Children that age can't make informed decisions about their own welfare. That's why we have family court. Celeste is 8 years old, but she's been taking care of her sisters since their mother died. She understands. Miss Ashford." Judge Hawthorne's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I'm beginning to understand why Miss Granger has concerns about your judgment. You seem to view these children as your property rather than human beings with their own family connections." The accusation was so wrong it took Marcia's breath away. But before she could respond, Celeste spoke from her chair beside the court recorder. "Your Honor, I have something important to tell you." Every adult in the room turned toward the 8-year-old girl who sat with the posture of someone much older. "Celeste, sweetheart, the adults need to," Helena began. "I know what Mr. Marcus and the lady from Fairchild are planning," Celeste said clearly. "And I can prove it." The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward. "What do you mean you can prove it?" Celeste reached into her backpack and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind used for school projects. "I recorded them talking yesterday when they thought we were napping." Alexander Cranford lurched toward her. "Your Honor, this is inadmissible. A child can't." "Let me hear it," Judge Hawthorne said quietly. Celeste pressed play, and Marcus's voice filled the room. "How long after I get custody before I can surrender them?" A woman's voice responded. 6 weeks minimum. "Long enough to establish that you tried to make it work, but couldn't handle 3 children alone. The Whitmore family is paying $200,000 for all 3 girls. They specifically requested sisters. And my cut? $25,000 as agreed. Just remember, no contact with them after the transfer. The new family wants a clean slate." The recording changed everything, but it also painted a target on Celeste's back. Because Helena Granger and her associates had just realized that an 8-year-old girl was the only witness who could bring down their entire operation. And they would spend the next 26 years making sure she never felt safe enough to testify again. The recording played twice more before Judge Hawthorne finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "Mr. Cranford, I assume you have an explanation for your client's voice on this recording?" Alexander's expensive suit couldn't hide the sweat beading on his forehead. "Your Honor, this recording was obtained illegally by a minor without consent. Even if authentic, it's inadmissible in family court proceedings." "Perhaps, but it's certainly admissible in criminal court." Judge Hawthorne pressed her intercom. "Please have Bailiff Thornton contact Detective Services immediately." Marcus Pembroke bolted from his chair. "I never agreed to hurt those kids. They said it was a legitimate adoption, that the family just wanted to skip the waiting lists." "Shut up," Alexander hissed, but the damage was done. Helena Granger's clipboard slipped from nerveless fingers, scattering papers across the floor. For 6 months, she'd orchestrated this custody battle with surgical precision, and now an 8-year-old with a recorder had demolished everything. "Miss Granger," Judge Hawthorne's voice could have frozen blood. "I believe you have some explaining to do as well." But Helena was already moving, her hand reaching for her phone with practiced efficiency. "Your Honor, I need to contact my supervisor immediately. There seem to be serious allegations about agency protocols that require." "You're not going anywhere." Judge Hawthorne nodded to the bailiff who'd just entered. Officer Thornton, please ensure Miss Granger remains available for questioning. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Alexander was arguing about client privilege while Marcus sat with his head in his hands, mumbling about needing another fix. Helena stood frozen by the door, calculating whether she could reach her car before the police arrived. Marcia pulled the three girls close, hardly daring to believe it was over. Is it finished? Celeste whispered. Are we safe now? I think so, baby. I think you saved us. But Marcia's relief lasted exactly 37 seconds. The time it took for Helena to make one final, desperate phone call. Code Black, Helena said quietly into her phone. The Ashford situation has been compromised. Initiate containment protocol immediately. 26 years later, those two words, containment protocol, would destroy Marcia's life. Because Helena Granger had just activated a network of corrupt officials who specialized in long-term revenge, and they were very, very patient. Detective Dylan Ellsworth arrived within minutes, but he wasn't alone. He brought Agent Carter Covington from the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, a grim man whose reputation for dismantling criminal networks was legendary. Miss Beckwith, Agent Covington addressed Celeste formally, as if speaking to an adult. That recording you made, do you understand how important it is? Celeste nodded solemnly. There are other children, aren't there? Children who don't have anyone to fight for them. Yes, and your evidence might help us save them. But even as Agent Covington spoke, Helena's phone call was bearing fruit. Within hours, key witnesses would begin disappearing. Computer files would be mysteriously corrupted. Bank records would vanish. By morning, Fairchild Family Services would exist only as an empty office and a disconnected phone number. The first sign of the counterattack came that evening. Sarah Lockwood called Marcia with barely concealed panic in her voice. Something's wrong. Judge Hawthorne just called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. She says there are irregularities in Celeste's recording that need to be addressed. What kind of irregularities? I don't know, but Alexander Cranford filed a motion claiming the recording was fabricated using voice synthesis technology. He has expert testimony saying it's a fake. Marcia's blood turned to ice. That's impossible. Celeste made that recording herself. I believe you, but they're claiming you coached her to create false evidence. Marcia, they're talking about charging you with conspiracy to commit fraud and child endangerment. The room spun around her. How can they prove something that isn't true? The same way they've been manipulating this case from the beginning, with money, connections, and people who have a lot to lose if the truth comes out. That night, Marcia sat on the edge of Celeste's bed, watching the little girl who'd risked everything to save her family. Celeste, some bad people are going to say you lied about that recording. But I didn't lie. I know, sweetheart, but they're very powerful, and they might be able to convince other people that you did. Celeste sat up, her 8-year-old face deadly serious. What happens to us if they win? I don't know. It was the first time Marcia had admitted her complete helplessness to any of the girls, and the honesty hung between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. I won't let them separate us again, Celeste said quietly. I won't. Baby, you've done everything you can. You've been so brave. No. Celeste's voice carried an authority that shouldn't have existed in someone so young. I recorded more than just that conversation. And if they want to play dirty, I can play dirty too. Marcia's heart stopped. What do you mean? I've been recording everything for weeks. Every time Helena came to check on us, every phone call Marcus made in the hallway, every meeting they thought we weren't listening to. Celeste pulled a shoebox from under her bed, revealing 3 more digital recorders. I knew they were lying about everything from the beginning. Celeste, why didn't you tell me? Because grown-ups always want to do things the right way, even when the right way doesn't work. Sometimes kids have to protect themselves. The weight of what this 8-year-old had been carrying alone brought tears to Marcia's eyes. But before she could respond, car doors slammed outside their apartment. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. Authoritative knocking at the door. Police! Open up! Marcia and Celeste looked at each other with the understanding that their brief moment of victory was over. Whatever Helena's containment protocol involved, it was about to begin. But as Marcia opened the door to face whatever came next, she had no idea that Celeste had already hidden copies of every recording in 3 different locations around the apartment building. The 8-year-old had learned that adults couldn't always be trusted to protect children, but children could learn to protect themselves. The officers at the door weren't there to arrest anyone. They were there to deliver a court order removing the children from Marcia's care immediately, pending investigation into allegations of evidence tampering and emotional manipulation. "This is impossible," Sarah protested from the phone as Marcia read the order aloud. "Judge Hawthorne wouldn't sign something like this without a hearing." "It's not from Judge Hawthorne," Marcia said, her voice hollow. "It's from Judge Blackwood in Circuit Court. Apparently, this case has been transferred to his jurisdiction due to concerns about judicial bias." Judge Blackwood, a man whose campaign had been funded by several prominent families known for their charitable donations to organizations like Fairchild Family Services. The fix was in, and it was comprehensive. "Girls, go pack a bag," Marcia said quietly. "No." Celeste stood in the hallway like a tiny sentinel. "I'm not going anywhere with them." "Sweetheart, we don't have a choice." "There's always a choice." Celeste looked directly at the lead officer. "I want to speak to Agent Covington before you take us anywhere." The officer, a decent man named Garrett Danvers who'd spent years dealing with traumatized children, knelt to Celeste's eye level. "Honey, I understand you're scared, but we have a court order. Agent Covington isn't involved in family court proceedings. He will be after he hears what else I recorded." Officer Danvers glanced at his partner, then at Marcia. Something in Celeste's voice, the absolute certainty of someone who held cards nobody knew about, made him pause. "What kind of recordings?" "The kind that prove Helena Granger has been selling children for 5 years. And the kind that prove Judge Blackwood knew about it." The silence in the apartment was deafening. Officer Danvers pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, I need you to contact Agent Covington from the FBI task force immediately. Tell him we have a juvenile witness with potential evidence in an ongoing federal investigation." Celeste smiled for the first time in days. "Can we wait for him before I pack my bag?" But even as help was on the way, Helena Granger was already implementing the next phase of her containment protocol. Because if they couldn't silence an 8-year-old witness through legal channels, there were other ways to ensure her testimony never saw daylight. The call Helena made that night would set in motion a chain of events that wouldn't reach its conclusion for 26 years. When Marcia would find herself in an interrogation room, accused of murdering an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitmore, while 3 accomplished women raced against time to uncover a conspiracy that had been growing in darkness for decades. Because the recording Celeste made that night, the one that would prove Judge Blackwood's involvement in the trafficking network, would mysteriously disappear from evidence storage. And the only people who knew it existed would spend the next 26 years watching over their shoulders, waiting for the moment when their enemies finally decided to collect on old debts. Agent Covington arrived 30 minutes later, but he brought devastating news. "The FBI task force has been suspended," he announced grimly as Officer Danvers led him into the apartment. "As of 4 hours ago, I no longer have jurisdiction over the Fairchild investigation." Marcia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. How is that possible? Someone with significant influence made phone calls to Washington. "The case has been transferred to local authorities pending review of investigative procedures." His voice carried the bitter taste of a man who'd seen political interference destroy justice before. "I'm here as a private citizen, nothing more." Celeste stepped forward, still clutching her shoebox of recordings. "But you can still listen to what I found, right?" Agent Covington knelt to her eye level, his expression gentle despite the circumstances. "Celeste, anything you tell me now can't be used in federal court. But yes, I can listen." What followed was an hour of revelations that painted a picture of corruption so vast it took everyone's breath away. Helena Granger's voice discussing specific judges who could be influenced. Alexander Cranford coordinating with wealthy families who paid premium prices for children with particular characteristics. And most damaging of all, Judge Blackwood himself, recorded during a meeting Celeste had observed while hiding in a supply closet at the courthouse. "The Ashford situation needs to be contained permanently," Judge Blackwood's voice crackled from the tiny speaker. "She's too stubborn to be bought, too clean to be blackmailed. But everyone has pressure points." "What are you suggesting?" Helena's voice responded. "Document everything. Every conversation, every decision, every moment of instability. Build a file that shows she's an unfit guardian who coached children to lie about their father. When the time comes, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, we'll have everything we need to destroy her credibility completely." Agent Covington's jaw tightened as he listened. "They've been planning your destruction from the beginning." "But this proves they're guilty," Marcia said desperately. "It proves they're guilty of things I can no longer investigate." Agent Covington's voice was heavy with frustration. Without federal authority, these recordings are just audio files with no chain of custody. Any defense attorney would get them thrown out. Officer Danvers cleared his throat. Agent Covington, what about protective custody for the family? If these people are as dangerous as they sound, on what grounds? No one has made specific threats. Officially, this is a family court matter involving custody disputes and evidence tampering allegations. The walls were closing in from every direction, but the cruelest blow was yet to come. Sarah Lockwood arrived looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. Marcia, I have to withdraw as your attorney. What? Why? Someone filed a complaint with the state bar alleging that I coached you to fabricate evidence and exploit vulnerable children for publicity. There's going to be an investigation, and until it's resolved, I can't represent you in any matter involving these children. But the real devastation wasn't losing Sarah. It was the realization that Helena's network had been building files on everyone who'd helped them. Agent Covington, Officer Danvers, even Judge Hawthorne would soon face career-ending accusations. The conspiracy wasn't just covering up their crimes. They were systematically destroying anyone who'd witnessed them. The temporary foster placement was a nightmare wrapped in bureaucratic politeness. Celeste, Ivy, and Paige were separated despite Marcia's desperate pleas, placed in 3 different homes, to prevent continued emotional manipulation and allow for individual assessment. Celeste went to the Sinclair family, a cold, sterile household where children were expected to be seen but not heard. Ivy was placed with the Radcliffes, well-meaning people who nonetheless treated her like an exotic pet project. Paige, the youngest and most vulnerable, ended up with the Montags, who specialized in difficult children and ran their home like a minimum security prison. Marcia was allowed supervised visits twice a week, 1 hour each time, with a social worker documenting every word and gesture. The first visit nearly destroyed her. Celeste sat rigidly in her chair, her 8-year-old shoulders carrying burdens that would break most adults. They listened to everything, she whispered during a brief moment when the social worker stepped out. They read our mail. They ask questions about you every day. What kind of questions? Whether you ever hit us. Whether you gave us alcohol or drugs. Whether you made us lie about Marcus. Celeste's voice was barely audible. They keep saying you're sick, that you convinced yourself we were your real children because you can't have babies of your own. The psychological warfare was surgical in its precision. Take a woman who'd sacrificed everything to protect 3 children, then slowly poison their relationship by suggesting her love was actually a symptom of mental illness. Ivy had stopped speaking entirely. She sat through the visit staring at her hands, flinching whenever anyone moved too quickly. The Radcliffes had reported concerning behaviors. Nightmares, refusing to eat, asking repeatedly when she could go home to Mama Marcia. Paige was the worst. At 5 years old, she was too young to understand the psychological manipulation, but old enough to feel abandoned. Why don't you want us anymore? She asked through tears. The Montags say you gave us away because we were too much trouble. Each visit was designed to break down the bonds between them, to make the children doubt everything they'd believed about love and family and safety. But the visits weren't the cruelest part of Helena's containment protocol. The cruelest part was the systematic destruction of Marcia's life outside the children. First, she was terminated from her job at the hospital. Budget cuts, they said, but 3 nurses with less seniority kept their positions. Then her landlord received an anonymous call reporting drug activity in her apartment. The subsequent police search found nothing, but the lease violation notice arrived the next day. Her credit cards were mysteriously canceled due to suspicious activity. Her bank account was frozen pending investigation of unusual transaction patterns. Within 2 weeks, Marcia went from being a working woman with a stable home to being unemployed, effectively homeless, and financially destroyed. It's textbook destruction, Agent Covington told her during a chance meeting at a coffee shop. Make the target appear unstable, unreliable, desperate. By the time anyone questions the narrative, it's too late to prove the person was set up. How do I fight this? You don't. That's the genius of it. Every move you make to defend yourself becomes evidence of the instability they're claiming. Fight too hard and you're obsessive. Don't fight hard enough and you're admitting guilt. But Agent Covington was wrong about one thing. Marcia wasn't completely defenseless. Because Celeste had given her something during that first supervised visit. A tiny piece of paper with an address and the words, "Emergency," only written in 8-year-old handwriting. What Celeste had found wasn't just evidence of corruption. It was proof of something much more dangerous. The address led to a storage unit rented under a false name, paid for with cash Celeste had somehow accumulated over months of careful planning. Inside, Marcia found dozens of recordings, photographs, and documents that painted a picture of institutional corruption reaching far beyond Fairchild Family Services. Judges taking bribes. Social workers selling information about vulnerable families. Police officers looking the other way when certain children disappeared from the system. But the most devastating discovery was a ledger in Helena's own handwriting, documenting not just adoptions but something far worse. Children who'd been disposed of when they became too problematic to place. Names, dates, methods. 47 children over 8 years. Children who'd asked too many questions, who'd tried to contact their biological families, who'd threatened to expose what they'd witnessed. Marcia's hands shook as she read entry after entry. These weren't just illegal adoptions. This was systematic murder disguised as accidental deaths, runaways, and suicides. And at the bottom of the most recent page, in Helena's neat handwriting, Ashford children, high risk. Recommend permanent solution if containment fails. The storage unit also contained something else, a letter addressed to Marcia in Celeste's careful 8-year-old handwriting. Mama Marcia, if you're reading this, something bad happened and they took us away from you. I found this place by following Helena one day when she thought I was napping at the courthouse. I copied everything I could before she came back. I know you'll find a way to save us, but if something happens to me before you can, make sure everyone knows what they did. I love you. We all love you. Don't let them win. Celeste. Marcia sat in the dusty storage unit, surrounded by evidence of horrors she could barely comprehend, and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to war. But as Marcia photographed every document and copied every recording, Helena Granger was implementing the final phase of her containment protocol. The 3 girls weren't just being psychologically manipulated in foster care. They were being prepared for permanent disappearance. And Marcia had less than 72 hours to save them before they vanished into the same network that had claimed 47 other children. Marcia had 72 hours to save 3 children from a network that had murdered 47 others, and she was completely alone. Agent Covington couldn't help. His career was hanging by a thread after the federal investigation was shut down. Sarah Lockwood was fighting for her legal license. Officer Danvers had been transferred to a different precinct after asking too many questions about judicial corruption. Everyone who'd tried to help her had been systematically destroyed. But Marcia had something Helena's network hadn't expected. 26 years of working in hospitals, where life and death decisions were made every day, and where sometimes breaking rules was the only way to save lives. She started with Dylan Ellsworth, her old friend from high school who'd first connected her to the federal investigation. Dylan, I need you to listen to me very carefully, she said over a payphone outside a convenience store. In 72 hours, Celeste, Ivy, and Paige are going to disappear forever. And I have proof that 47 other children have already been murdered by the same people. Marcia, I can't. My captain told me to stay away from anything related to your case. If I get caught, then don't get caught. Her voice carried the steel of someone who'd run out of options. But if you do nothing, 3 little girls are going to die, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you could have prevented it. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. What do you need? Dylan finally asked. The plan Marcia outlined was insane, illegal, and their only chance. Dylan would use his police contacts to create a distraction, a fake emergency that would pull social workers away from monitoring the foster homes. Marcia would have a 30-minute window to extract the girls from 3 different locations simultaneously. How are you going to be in 3 places at once? Dylan asked. I'm not. I'm going to trust that an 8-year-old is as smart as I think she is. But what Marcia didn't know was that Celeste had already been planning her own escape. And at that exact moment, she was teaching Ivy and Paige a hand signal system that would either reunite their family or get them all killed trying. The call to Celeste came during the supervised phone time at the Sinclair household, with Mrs. Sinclair listening to every word. How are you feeling today, sweetheart? Marcia asked, using the code they'd developed. I'm learning so much about butterflies, Celeste replied, her voice steady despite Mrs. Sinclair's suspicious glare. Did you know that some butterflies migrate thousands of miles to find their way home? Butterflies, their code word for escape plans. That's fascinating. What else are you learning? Well, Some butterflies travel in groups of 3, and they use special signals to stay together during long journeys. They meet at flower gardens when the sun is highest. 3 butterflies. Hand signals. Meeting at the park at noon. That sounds like a wonderful science project. I love you, baby. I love you too, Mama Marcia. And don't worry, butterflies always find their way home. Mrs. Sinclair hung up the phone with a frown. That was an odd conversation about insects. Celeste has always been interested in nature, the social worker noted on her clipboard, missing entirely that an 8-year-old had just coordinated a 3-part escape plan under their noses. The next 24 hours were the longest of Marcia's life. She used the evidence from the storage unit to contact 3 journalists, 2 child advocacy organizations, and a retired FBI agent who specialized in exposing institutional corruption. But she also knew that none of them could move fast enough to save the girls. The night before the planned rescue, Marcia sat in her car outside Celeste's foster home, watching the window where a small figure occasionally appeared. She was about to risk everything, her freedom, her future, possibly her life, to save 3 children who'd already been through too much trauma. If she succeeded, they'd be fugitives. If she failed, the girls would disappear, and she'd spend the rest of her life in prison for kidnapping. But as she watched Celeste's silhouette in the window, Marcia remembered the night she'd found them behind the bus stop. 3 small figures who'd learned that adults couldn't be trusted to protect them. She'd made a promise that night. She'd told them they'd never be abandoned again. Some promises were worth dying for. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dylan. Emergency dispatch scheduled for 11:47 a.m. You'll have exactly 30 minutes before anyone realizes what's happening. After that, every cop in the state will be looking for you. 30 minutes to disappear with 3 children and somehow stay hidden long enough for the evidence to surface and clear their names. The odds were impossible. But Marcia had spent 26 years learning that impossible things happened every day. Sometimes you just had to be brave enough to make them happen. At 11:30 a.m., as Marcia drove toward the first foster home with her heart pounding, she had no idea that Helena Granger had discovered the storage unit. The evidence was already being destroyed, the journalists were being discredited, and a team of cleaners was preparing to eliminate the last witnesses to 26 years of murder. The girls weren't just being rescued. They were racing against killers who had nothing left to lose. The emergency Dylan created was masterful. A fabricated report of a gas leak at the Department of Social Services building that required immediate evacuation of all personnel. Within minutes, social workers were fleeing the building, leaving their cases temporarily unmonitored. Marcia's first stop was the Radcliffe house, where Ivy had been placed. She knocked on the door wearing scrubs and carrying a medical bag she'd borrowed from the hospital. "Mrs. Radcliffe? I'm Nurse Carmichael from Children's Hospital. We received a report that Ivy may have been exposed to tuberculosis during a recent medical visit. I need to conduct an immediate health screening." Mrs. Radcliffe's face went pale. Tuberculosis? But she seemed fine this morning. The incubation period can mask symptoms. I need to examine her immediately and possibly transport her for testing. Where is she? Ivy appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide but understanding. She'd been waiting for the butterfly signal. "Come down, sweetheart," Marcia said gently. "We need to make sure you're healthy." As Ivy descended the stairs, she gave the hand signal Celeste had taught her. 3 quick taps against her leg. "Ready to fly." "I'll need to take her to the hospital for chest x-rays," Marcia announced. "The health department requires immediate isolation until we can confirm she hasn't been infected." Mrs. Radcliffe hesitated. "Shouldn't I call her social worker first?" "Ma'am, we're dealing with a potential public health emergency. Every minute of delay increases the risk of transmission to your family." Marcia's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to medical crises. "I can have her back within 2 hours, or I can call the health department to quarantine your entire household." 5 minutes later, Ivy was buckled into Marcia's car, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I knew you'd come back for us." The Montague house was more challenging. They ran their foster home like a business, with rigid schedules and security protocols. Marcia couldn't use the same medical emergency trick twice in the same neighborhood. Instead, she relied on Paige's intelligence and a plan that would have made Celeste proud. At exactly 12:15, Paige approached Mrs. Montague with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Montague, I think I'm really sick. My stomach hurts so bad, and I threw up in the bathroom." Mrs. Montague, who charged the state premium rates for caring for difficult children, Couldn't risk having a sick child on her premises during inspection week. "We need to take you to urgent care immediately," she announced, grabbing her keys. But as they walked toward the car, Paige suddenly darted toward the street, shouting, "Mama, Marcia!" Marcia emerged from behind a parked van, arms open, as Paige ran straight into her embrace. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Montague demanded. "Emergency custody hearing was moved up," Marcia lied smoothly. "Judge Blackwood wants to see Paige immediately. I have the court order right here." She handed Mrs. Montague an official-looking document Dylan had helped her create. Not technically legal, but convincing enough to buy precious minutes. "This doesn't look right," Mrs. Montague said, studying the papers. "Then call the courthouse," Marcia suggested. But the judge specifically said that failure to comply with his direct order would result in contempt charges. "Your choice." Mrs. Montague looked at the papers, at Paige clinging to Marcia, at the potential legal liability of defying a judge's order. Business calculations won over suspicion. 2 down, 1 to go. But as Marcia drove toward the Sinclair house to collect Celeste, police scanners across the city were crackling with reports of missing foster children. Helena's network had discovered the deception faster than expected. They had minutes, not hours, before every road out of the city was blocked. The Sinclair house was in chaos when Marcia arrived. Celeste was gone. She said she was going to the library, Mrs. Sinclair explained to the police officer who'd just arrived. But that was 2 hours ago, and the library says she never showed up. Marcia's heart stopped. Had Helena's people already taken her? But then she saw it, carved into the bark of the oak tree outside the Sinclair house. 3 small butterfly symbols pointing toward the park. Celeste had escaped on her own and was waiting at their predetermined meeting spot. Marcia drove toward the park with Ivy and Paige huddled in the back seat, police sirens wailing in the distance. They had minutes before every cop in the city would be searching for them. She found Celeste sitting calmly on a bench, her backpack beside her, feeding ducks as if she had all the time in the world. "I was starting to worry you wouldn't make it," Celeste said as Marcia approached. "The police came by about 10 minutes ago, but I told them I was waiting for my mom to finish her jog." Even under pressure, even at 8 years old, Celeste was thinking 3 moves ahead. "We need to go," Marcia said urgently. "They know we're together now." "I know, but we're not running away anymore." Celeste shouldered her backpack with the determination of someone much older. "We're going home." As they drove away from the park, police cars converging from 3 directions, Marcia realized that Celeste was right. They weren't running away from something. They were running toward the life they'd built together, the family they'd chosen, the love that no amount of corruption could destroy. But first, they had to survive the next 24 hours. Because Helena Granger had just made the call that would transform their rescue into a manhunt. Every highway was about to be blocked, every safe house would be watched, and every person who'd ever helped them would become a target. Their 30-minute head start had become a race against time, and the finish line was either freedom or a shallow grave in the woods where 47 other children had already been buried. 26 years later, Detective Blake Carrington stared at the evidence board in disbelief as 3 women systematically dismantled everything he thought he knew about the Marcia Ashford case. "You're telling me that a woman accused of murdering an elderly patient is actually the victim of a decades-long conspiracy?" Blake's voice carried the skepticism of a man who'd seen every con game in the book. Celeste Beckwith, now a civil rights attorney whose reputation for destroying corrupt officials was legendary, spread photographs across the conference table with surgical precision. "Detective Carrington, what do you know about the Fairchild Family Services investigation from 1998? "Never heard of it." "Of course you haven't. It was buried along with the evidence." Celeste's voice carried the same unshakable certainty it had possessed when she was 8 years old. "Dr. Ivy Harrington, would you please explain to the detective what we discovered about Mrs. Whitmore's death?" Dr. Ivy Harrington, the frightened 6-year-old who'd hidden behind Marcia's legs, was now a respected forensic pathologist whose testimony had overturned dozens of wrongful convictions. "The official cause of death was medication overdose followed by accidental fall," Ivy said, pulling up digital files on her laptop. "But when I examined the original autopsy photos, the ones that mysteriously disappeared from evidence storage, I found something interesting." She turned the screen toward Blake. "These bruise patterns on Mrs. Whitmore's wrists and neck are inconsistent with a fall. They're consistent with manual strangulation followed by post-mortem staging to simulate an accident." Blake leaned forward, studying the images. You're saying she was murdered? I'm saying she was murdered, and someone very skilled at covering up murders made it look like an accident. Someone who's had 26 years of practice. The third woman spoke for the first time. Paige Sinclair had become one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country, specializing in exposing institutional corruption. At 31, she still carried herself with the watchful intensity of someone who'd learned too young that adults couldn't always be trusted. Detective, I've spent the past 3 months following a paper trail that connects Mrs. Whitmore's death to the same network that tried to sell us in 1998. She slid a thick folder across the table. Helena Granger died 5 years ago, but her network survived. They've been operating under different names, different agencies, but the same basic business model, trafficking vulnerable children to wealthy buyers. That's impossible. Child trafficking rings don't operate for decades. This one does. Celeste's interruption was sharp. Because it's not just a trafficking ring. It's a network of corrupt officials, judges, social workers, and administrators who've built an entire shadow system for disposing of inconvenient people. Children who ask too many questions. Whistleblowers who threaten their operations. And occasionally, elderly patients who see something they shouldn't. Blake felt the case he thought he understood crumbling around him. What does an elderly woman at a nursing home have to do with child trafficking from 26 years ago? Everything, Paige said quietly. Because Mrs. Whitmore wasn't just any elderly woman. She was Helena Granger's mother. The room went silent. Helena Granger changed her name when she started working in social services, Paige continued. Her birth name was Helena Whitmore. The woman Marcia is accused of murdering was the mother of the woman who tried to sell us as children. But the revelation about Mrs. Whitmore's true identity was just the beginning. Because what the 3 women had discovered in Mrs. Whitmore's personal effects would expose 26 years of murders disguised as accidents, suicides, and natural deaths, including the real reason Marcia had been chosen as the perfect scapegoat. Blake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. Even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't change the evidence. Marcia Ashford was the last person in Mrs. Whitmore's room. Her fingerprints were on the medication cart. The security footage was edited, Ivy interrupted. I've had 3 independent video analysts examine the timestamp data. There's a 47-minute gap that was digitally removed from the footage. 47 minutes, Celeste added meaningfully. The same number as the children Helena's network murdered over 8 years. They're not even trying to hide the symbolism. Blake looked at the evidence they'd presented. Medical reports, video analysis, financial records connecting current nursing home administrators to the old Fairchild network. It was comprehensive, professional, and absolutely devastating to his case. Why are you telling me this instead of going directly to the prosecutor? Because Prosecutor Bradley Davenport was Helena Granger's nephew, Paige said simply. His real name is Bradley Granger. He changed it when he went to law school, but the family connection is documented. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. How many people had spent decades planning this revenge against one woman who dared to protect 3 children? There's something else, Celeste said quietly. Something we haven't told you yet. She pulled out a small digital recorder, the same type she'd used as a child, though this one was far more sophisticated. Mrs. Whitmore called me 3 days before she died. At first, I thought it was a wrong number. She was confused, talking about her daughter and some children she'd helped traffic. But then she said something that stopped me cold. Celeste pressed play. Mrs. Whitmore's elderly voice filled the room, shaky but determined. Celeste? Is this Celeste Beckwith? I know this sounds crazy, but I'm Helena Granger's mother. I know what my daughter did to you and your sisters 26 years ago. I know about the other children too. I've been carrying this guilt for decades, and I can't die with these secrets. They're planning to hurt Marcia Ashford, the woman who saved you. They're going to frame her for my murder. Blake's blood went cold. She knew she was going to be killed. More than that, she was working with us to expose the network. She had evidence, documents Helena had hidden in her house, recordings of conversations between network members, financial records showing payments to judges and officials. Where is this evidence? That's the problem, Ivy said grimly. Mrs. Whitmore hid it somewhere in the nursing home. She was supposed to give us the location the day she died, but someone got to her first. And now we have 72 hours to find that evidence before Marcia's trial begins, and she's convicted of a murder that was actually committed by the same people who tried to sell us as children. Blake stared at the three women who'd just turned his entire worldview upside down. An hour ago, he'd been investigating a simple case of an unstable woman who'd killed an elderly patient for inheritance money. Now he was looking at evidence of a conspiracy, so vast it made him question everything he thought he knew about justice. "What do you need from me?" "Access to the nursing home," Celeste said immediately. "Official access, so we can search for Mrs. Whitmore's hidden evidence without being arrested for breaking and entering." "And backup," Paige added. "If we're right about this, the people running the nursing home are the same ones who murdered 47 children. They won't hesitate to kill us to protect their secret." "And most importantly," Ivy said, pulling up crime scene photos on her laptop, "we need you to look at this case with fresh eyes. Not as a detective trying to prove guilt, but as someone trying to find the truth." Blake studied the photos again, this time looking for signs of staging rather than evidence of Marcia's guilt. The medication bottles scattered in a pattern that was almost too perfect. The wheelchair positioned at an angle that didn't match the fall trajectory. The missing 47 minutes of security footage. "Jesus," he whispered. "How did I miss all of this?" "Because you were investigating the crime they wanted you to see," Celeste said gently. "The real crime, the systematic murder of witnesses to decades of child trafficking, was hidden underneath." Blake made a decision that would either save an innocent woman's life or destroy his career. "What's our first move?" But as the four of them planned their investigation into Sunset Manor, Administrator Harrington was watching from security cameras they didn't know existed. The same network that had spent 26 years planning their revenge had also spent 26 years preparing for the moment when Celeste, Ivy, and Paige might return to expose them. And they had one final trap that would either eliminate all four witnesses or prove that sometimes love really could triumph over decades of carefully planned evil. The return to Sunset Manor felt like walking into a beautifully maintained tomb. Administrator Harrington greeted them with professional courtesy that didn't quite hide the predatory intelligence in his eyes. "Detective Carrington, what a surprise. I wasn't expecting another investigation so close to the trial." "Just tying up some loose ends," Blake said casually. "These ladies represent Mrs. Whitmore's estate. They're here to collect her personal effects." Harrington's smile faltered for just a moment, long enough for Celeste to catch the flash of recognition in his eyes. "Of course, though I should mention that most of Mrs. Whitmore's belongings were already claimed by her previous visitors." "Previous visitors?" Ivy asked. "Yes, several people came by claiming to be relatives. We required proper documentation, of course, but they seemed quite thorough in their collection efforts. The evidence Mrs. Whitmore had hidden was already gone. 26 years of planning, and they'd been one step behind the entire time. But Celeste hadn't survived Helena Granger's psychological warfare by giving up easily. "Administrator Harrington, I'm curious about your background. How long have you been working in elder care?" "About 15 years. I started right out of college." "Interesting. Did you know that your employment application lists Helena Granger as a reference?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Celeste said with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. "I'm stating that Helena Granger recruited you specifically to work at this facility, that you've been part of her network since college, and that Mrs. Whitmore's murder was planned months in advance." Harrington's professional mask finally slipped. "You have no proof of any connection between myself and—" "Actually, we do." Paige pulled out her phone, displaying a photograph. "This is you at Helena Granger's funeral 5 years ago. You're listed in the guest book as beloved godson. Want to explain how someone you've never heard of became your godmother?" The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Blake's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon as he realized they were trapped in a building with someone who'd helped murder dozens of people over the years. But it was Ivy who delivered the final blow. "There's something else, Administrator Harrington. Something Mrs. Whitmore told us before she died." Ivy's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd spent years testifying in courtrooms. "She said Helena kept detailed records of everyone in the network. Names, dates, financial transactions, methods of operation. And she said those records were hidden somewhere that would only be found if something happened to her." Mrs. Whitmore was an elderly woman with dementia. Whatever she claimed to remember was corroborated by physical evidence we've already turned over to federal authorities, Celeste finished smoothly. "Did you really think we'd walk into this building without backup?" It was a bluff, but a convincing one. Harrington's face went pale as he realized his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. You don't understand, he said desperately. The things Helena did, I was just following orders. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Then help us, Blake said quietly. Tell us where Mrs. Whitmore hid the evidence, and maybe we can work something out. For a moment, it looked like Harrington might cooperate. But then his expression hardened with the resolve of someone who'd been planning for this moment for years. I'm sorry, he said, reaching for something under his desk. But some secrets are worth dying for. The alarm that suddenly blared through Sunset Manor wasn't a fire drill. It was a lockdown protocol that would trap everyone inside while a final, devastating plan unfolded. Because Harrington hadn't been reaching for a weapon. He'd been activating a system that would eliminate all 4 witnesses and make it look like a tragic accident during a natural disaster. Helena Granger's network had spent 26 years preparing for this moment, and they weren't going down without taking their enemies with them. The lockdown alarm screamed through Sunset Manor as steel barriers slammed down over windows and emergency exits sealed automatically. Harrington's finger had triggered more than just a security protocol. It had activated a system designed to eliminate witnesses through what would appear to be a tragic carbon monoxide leak during a power failure. Gas leak protocol initiated, an automated voice announced. All personnel remain in lockdown positions until emergency services arrive. But emergency services weren't coming. The system had been designed to prevent rescue while deadly gas flooded the building. Blake drew his weapon, but Harrington was already backing toward a hidden exit that only administrators knew about. 26 years we've been planning for this moment, Harrington said, his professional mask completely gone. You think 3 little girls grown up and 1 corrupt cop can destroy what Helena built? We don't think it, Celeste said with deadly calm. We know it. She held up her phone, showing a live video feed being broadcast across multiple social media platforms and news outlets. Surprise, Godfather. Everything you've said for the past 10 minutes has been streaming live to 50,000 viewers. Including your confession to murdering Mrs. Whitmore and your admission to being part of Helena's network. Harrington's face went white. That's impossible. We control all the communications in this building. You control the building's systems, Paige interrupted, pulling out a sophisticated broadcasting device. You don't control satellite uplinks installed by investigative journalists who've been planning this confrontation for months. The trap Helena's network had spent decades preparing had become their own downfall. Every word, every admission, every desperate attempt to eliminate witnesses was being broadcast live to the world. But the immediate danger was real. The gas levels were rising, and even with their evidence being transmitted, they still needed to survive the next few minutes. Ivy, Celeste said calmly, you're the medical expert. How long do we have? Dr. Ivy Harrington, who'd spent years studying toxicology and forensic pathology, examined the air vents with professional precision. Based on the building's ventilation system and current gas concentration, maybe 8 minutes before we lose consciousness. Blake, how long for backup to arrive? Detective Carrington was already on his radio, but his face was grim. Emergency services show a 12-minute response time. The lockdown protocol is designed to prevent entry even by first responders. They were trapped in a building designed to kill them, with backup that couldn't reach them in time. But Celeste smiled, the same determined smile she'd worn as an 8-year-old facing down a corrupt social worker. Then we don't wait for rescue. We rescue ourselves. What none of them realized was that Marcia Ashford wasn't sitting helplessly in her jail cell. When her 3 daughters hadn't checked in according to their prearranged schedule, she'd implemented a plan that would either free her or ensure the truth survived even if they didn't. The hidden exit Harrington was fleeing toward had been Celeste's first priority when they'd entered the building. 26 years of legal training had taught her to always have multiple escape routes, and she'd spent her childhood learning that adults who seemed helpful were often the most dangerous. Paige, do you have the override codes? Already uploaded, Paige replied, her fingers flying over her device. Hacking into the building's security system took 3 weeks, but I've had full administrative control since we walked in here. The steel barriers over the windows began retracting with mechanical precision. Ivy, can you counteract the gas? Not counteract, but minimize. Dr. Harrington was already pulling medical supplies from her bag, supplies she'd brought specifically for this possibility. These oxygen masks will buy us additional time, but we need ventilation now. Blake, how's your cardio? Detective Carrington looked confused until he saw Celeste pointing toward the skylight 3 stories above them. You want me to climb to the roof? I want you to survive long enough to arrest Administrator Harrington when this is over." What followed was a perfectly choreographed operation that would have made their mother proud. Celeste used her legal authority to coordinate with emergency services via the live stream, directing them to the building's hidden vulnerabilities. Paige broadcast real-time updates while simultaneously hacking into every database that contained evidence of the network's crimes. Ivy provided medical support while documenting everything for forensic evidence. And Blake Carrington, an honest cop who'd spent his career fighting corruption without realizing how deep it went, became the instrument of justice they'd been waiting 26 years to find. Harrington made it halfway to his escape route before Blake tackled him in a hallway filled with 26 years of evidence. Filing cabinets full of forged documents, computers containing financial records of bribes and payoffs, and hidden rooms where Helena's network had planned their operations. "You have no idea what you're destroying," Harrington gasped as Blake handcuffed him. "The network reaches everywhere: judges, prosecutors, police commissioners. This doesn't end with me." "You're right," Celeste said, appearing in the hallway with gas mask in hand and laptop streaming live footage of the hidden rooms. "It ends with all of you." The evidence they'd broadcast live during the confrontation would trigger the largest corruption investigation in state history. Within hours, arrest warrants would be issued for dozens of officials. Within days, the network Helena had spent decades building would collapse entirely. But the real victory wasn't the destruction of a criminal organization. The real victory was what happened next. Because as Blake led Harrington away in handcuffs and emergency services flooded the building, a corrections officer was unlocking Marcia Ashford's cell with dismissal papers that had been expedited through a system that suddenly couldn't afford to keep an innocent woman imprisoned. And outside the jail, 3 accomplished women waited to give their mother the hug they'd been saving for 26 years. The reunion took place not in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but in the parking lot of the county jail, under fluorescent lights that flickered against an evening sky. Marcia Ashford walked out of custody looking older than her 68 years, but carrying herself with the dignity of someone who'd never broken, never surrendered, never stopped believing that love was stronger than corruption. Celeste saw her first and broke into a run, her professional composure dissolving into the joy of a child who'd found her way home. Ivy and Paige followed, and for a moment they were 8, 6, and 5 years old again. 3 little girls who'd learned that sometimes adults kept their promises. The hug lasted 5 minutes and 26 years simultaneously. "I told you I'd never stop fighting for you," Marcia whispered through tears. "And we told you we'd find a way to save you," Celeste whispered back. "Families don't abandon each other," Ivy added, her voice thick with emotion. "Even when it takes 26 years to come home," Paige finished. They stood in that parking lot, a former nurse's aide and 3 successful women who'd been shaped by her love, and proved that some bonds were stronger than any conspiracy designed to break them. The media attention that followed was intense but brief. Celeste handled the legal interviews with professional precision. Ivy provided medical testimony that definitively proved Mrs. Whitmore's murder. Paige wrote the investigative series that exposed every detail of Helena's network and won a Pulitzer Prize for public service journalism. But none of them talked about the most important part of the story: the quiet moments when Marcia tucked them into bed as children, the sacrifices she'd made working double shifts, the way she'd never stopped believing they'd find their way back to each other. 3 months later, they gathered for dinner at Marcia's new house, a small place with a garden where she could grow the vegetables she'd always dreamed of tending. Celeste brought legal documents showing the civil rights foundation she'd established in Helena's victims' names. Ivy brought medical research she was funding to help children recover from trafficking trauma. Paige brought the first draft of a book that would ensure the story was never forgotten. But mostly, they brought themselves, for women who'd learned that family wasn't about blood or law or social services forms. It was about choice, sacrifice, and the decision to keep loving each other even when the world tried to tear them apart. "What's next for you?" Celeste asked as they cleared dishes from dinner. Marcia smiled, looking out at her garden where tomatoes were finally beginning to ripen. "I think I'm ready to just be somebody's mother for a while. Not in crisis, not in court, not fighting anyone. Just family." "We'd like that too," Ivy said softly. "More than anything," Paige added. As the sun set over their small celebration, Detective Blake Carrington drove past the house where 4 women had rebuilt their lives from the ashes of conspiracy and corruption. His radio crackled with another case, another emergency, another chance to choose between convenience and justice. He thought about the lesson he'd learned from watching Celeste, Ivy, and Paige fight for their mother. That sometimes the most important victories happen not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the quiet moments when people refuse to give up on each other. His radio squawked again. Missing children case, possible trafficking connection. Blake Carrington smiled and reached for his radio. Unit 23 responding. And dispatch? Contact the Beckwith Foundation. Tell them we might need consulting services. Because some fights were too important to face alone. And some families, chosen families fought for families, families forged in love rather than law, were strong enough to change the world. Final CTA. Here's what I want you to think about. Marcia had $43 in her checking account when she decided to take in 3 homeless children. She could have walked past that bus stop and preserved her own financial stability. But she chose love over security, sacrifice over comfort. Now I'm curious, have you ever had a moment where you had to choose between what was safe for you and what was right for someone else? What did you choose and how did it change your life? Drop your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe, because these conversations about the choices that define us are just getting started.